a big hand for John.
Thank you. Unfortunately, my Dutch is very weak. Having done a little bit of work with Mark and Martijn, it improved a little bit, but more about what an air terminal is and a few services equipment rather than to be able to present in Dutch. So excuse my English. A quick background to me. I think one of the key things that seems to be a point of difference or a point of benefit with myself is I come at this with dual experience and dual training. So you'll see that I actually studied a double degree in structural engineering and computer science. And I did work as a structural engineer for about 10 years at 2 different companies. And then I developed some tools that helped me do the tasks and jobs that I had to do on the projects that I was assigned. I was pretty lucky, a lot of sports stadiums, an interesting footbridge or two, and a couple of towers. And I guess with a computer science degree working as a structural engineer, I wrote some spreadsheets and some little utilities and things like that helped me do my job. And that kept snowballing and snowballing. When I moved to London and worked for an offshoot of Arup called Expedition Engineering, I started learning about this application called Rhino and then getting more into actual plugin development and tool development. Anyone that's used Rhino, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, will know it's a pretty powerful scripting and programming environment. So again, it snowballed. Others in the office started using some of the tools I developed for Rhino. I started letting Arup use them. And when Arup were dependent on it enough that I could start charging for it, formed the business Geometry Gym. And nearly 10 years later, still working at it, which is great. So just some other quick background information that might give some insights into some of the things I'm going to talk about. You'll hear I'm from Australia with an Australian accent. I am an elected board member on Building Smart Australasia. I am involved with Building Smart International, particularly with the Model Support Group. So the Model Support Group is in charge of managing the improvements to the schema and the Ifc doc tool that Alex mentioned and a few other technical aspects of supporting Open BIM. And then the technical room, a common participant in that, particularly at the summits and the endeavours outside of the summits. Also do some consulting to Autodesk. I guess someone that knows IFC intimately and knows the Revit API a lot is of something of benefit to them. So I have been involved with helping them with nominated tasks about import and export of Revit. Some of those were use cases that particularly came from here in Holland and in France. So I saw a lot of discussion around the project base point export settings, and I don't know if I should put my hand up for some difficult questions, but I was involved in that. So depending on what conversations happen after this session, if you want to talk about that's possible. Any presentation I do gets pretty technical, but again, I'm going to try and keep that capped today and give, as Mark said, I want to demonstrate some use cases of IFC, maybe the way you haven't seen them before, and to explain what IFC is. No, not everyone should have to go into understanding IFC the way that I do, and we'll talk about some of the improvements that we should seek and demand to make that easier for everyday use of IFC as an exchange format or Open BIM. So IFC is technical and complex. I don't think anyone would argue with that. And part of that complexity is understanding the use case that you're trying to use IFC to exchange a model and what the implementations are that support this. So, to note, majority of implementations have a coordination, and you only need a primitive model to support coordination. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Who here's seen the End of Babel video? Only a few. Is it worth? I think it's worth playing. It explains IFC better than I can. Is everyone? I can never watch this enough. So I've cut this down to a shorter version. And if you've seen it all before, I'll stall it if you like.
처음 듣는 말인데요. 좀 제가 아는 말을 할 수 있겠어요?
Speak clearly. I can't understand.
The Tower of Babel. One of the biggest construction projects ever undertaken, designed to reach the heavens. But the engineers couldn't finish the job. Halfway through, everybody working on the tower was stricken with the inability to understand what the other fellow was saying. They were all still talking, but they weren't communicating. That incident is supposed to have taken place in about 5000 BC, and we've been trying to understand one another ever since. But not too long ago, thanks to technology, there came along an amazing invention that actually made this problem worse. What is it? The desktop computer, of course. Everybody's got one of these things today, and we've all set about busily automating every task we can think of. On a project like this one, for example, the designers have automated their drawing production, and the structural engineers have automated their calculations for determining the size of members, and the HVAC people have automated their calculation for thermal performance. But they're still not really communicating. You see, we haven't improved the processes that connect these tasks together. And that's because the software packages that make this computer do its job are made by hundreds of different companies. And each software program has its own way of defining terms for the computer to understand. So they all talk to the computer, but they don't talk to each other, which means the people who use them can't do a very good job of talking to one another either, at least not with their data files and electronic drawings and documents. And why is that a problem? Well, on a big project like this office building, for example, our fractured information system, this one we're all using, results in information that's often incompatible, inconsistent, or redundant. You can imagine what something like that adds to the cost of something like this. When you come right down to it, we're all wasting a lot of time. For example, an architect does an initial design and passes it off to the structural and HVAC engineers. Now, they all work in parallel, isolated, making changes as they see fit. When they get back together to try to integrate all of their decisions, well, the results are something of a mess. It takes iteration after iteration to finally get it right. But there's a move afoot to change all that, to make all of the software packages talk to each other, to make them all operate from a single shared building model that provides a common language for defining a building project, kind of a universal compatibility. It's being spearheaded by a company called Autodesk, in collaboration with industry partners such as AT&T, HOK Architects, Honeywell, Carrier, and Tishman Construction, to name a few. The idea is to have industry-wide definitions for every object we use to design, construct, and maintain buildings, and then to create industry-standard definitions for the relationships between these objects. What we're really talking about is interoperability, making things work together no matter who creates them, no matter who's involved. Sounds like a good idea, so you've probably got just two questions. How much will this cost me, and when can I get a hold of it? Well, it's not likely to cost very much at all, if indeed it ever costs you anything. The expense for the project is part of the research and development budgets of the corporations who are participating. The end result will simply be a new foundation within the software you buy. It will likely first appear as a feature of your next upgrade for AutoCAD-based applications. Then you'll find it in a growing number of non-CAD applications that can add information to the shared building model. It's easy to implement, so you're not looking at much for transition costs. There's no special hardware or peripherals or add-on software to purchase. In other words, it's more or less free, which is a pretty fair price for everything this project delivers, wouldn't you say? And now, when can you get your hands on it? Finished applications are still a few months away, but prototypes are already up and running. You can see them today at an Autodesk demonstration.
If you really think about buildings and the things in buildings, furniture, equipment, and so forth, you're really talking about objects, not lines on paper. Well, for the first time, the power of the computer and now the very imaginative creators of software are allowing us to come back and think about buildings in a fundamentally different way as collections of objects. And the foundation classes are about objects.
Autodesk's goal is to lead the way to a place where technology works the way it's supposed to. Open systems and partnerships are part of Autodesk's corporate philosophy and have been since the company's beginning. They believe that having more choices is inherently better than having fewer choices. And that's what this alliance is all about. They're leading the industry into the future, investing in new ideas that lead to better tools and better processes. This is technology gone right. This simple idea will let you capitalize on the promise computers made years ago. Finally, this will make it all work the way it's supposed to. It's an end to the technological Tower of Babel.
So again, apologies to those that might have seen that video before, but I mean, every time I watch it, I want to cry and laugh at the same time because, I mean, you might have picked up that video wasn't recorded yesterday, but the message is as true as it's ever been, I think. I mean, this was recorded about 20 years ago, and it's a bit unfortunate that we're still looking at advancing on some of the promises and realizations that were made all that time ago. I think it is great to come to Holland as well, because I really do see a strong push on Open BIM and actually achieving some of these goals. So it's nice to come here and meet many of you and have a chance to explain some of the work that that I've been doing and Building Smart have been doing to make that a reality. So I mentioned before about use case of IFC, and in particular IFC 2x3, which had only one particular use case, which was coordination. And typically the model quality that you'll then see is the model on the left-hand side. You only need a primitive model for coordination. And one of the promises of IFC 4 was a new use case called Design Transfer View, Alex mentioned earlier as well. And that is that ability to, I've got a model in Revit or I've got a model in EcoSim, and now I want to take it to ArchiCAD or Allplan or Vectorworks or whichever other application or process you might be using on that. And I guess the emphasis on my work has been on design transfer. I mean, coordination is an important use of IFC, but a lot of the work I'm going to demonstrate to you today is more about, well, how do we actually use IFC for the more intelligent model use cases downstream? I also think it's quite frustrating to be a user of IFC. I guess with a hybrid background in structural engineering as well as a software development tool, I can put both hats on. And when you're producing IFC files that are gigabytes in size, that's not particularly a good sign, and it shouldn't be the case. And again, I can only encourage you, if you are having frustrations and problems with IFC, put the pressure on your software vendors to improve these things. So typically for IFC 2x3, it's the two primary shape representations used are an extrusion, or if it's not an extrusion, then just to mesh the thing. And then if you get objects like fasteners or anything like a light fitting or anything that's not an extrusion, you end up with these great big huge IFC files because it meshes it normally to some sort of visualization tolerance. Whereas I guess a lot what we're looking for in BIM is an idealized representation. So this is sort of showing an example of some work I've done recently on decimating NURB shapes in Grasshopper and Rhino. And I know in particular Revit have made some improvements in this area to try and reduce file sizes, but again, we can only push them harder and harder. We really shouldn't be, if your file size is not proportional to the size, noting that IFC is a text file normally, but it should still be proportional to the size of your native proprietary file, not magnitudes better, or bigger, I should say. I'm going to talk a little bit about Generative Bim. I'm pretty sure everyone here would have heard of Dynamo as a graphical programming environment. Anyone here, how many here have used Grasshopper? A few? Good, okay. So, I mean, in my observation, that basically Ian started Dynamo as he was using Grasshopper as an engineer, and then he wanted Grasshopper for Revit, and that's what sort of motivated and inspired him to start writing Dynamo. And again, it has a very strong resemblance to Dynamo, obviously. It's a graphical programming environment where instead of manually using menus and buttons to model a structure, it's more like a graphical programming environment. And I think the big thing with Grasshopper is it brought programming back in the domain of more everyday designers rather than computer geeks like me with a computer science degree. And I think this is a really recent development that I've been exploring over the last couple of weeks. And it's actually now the ability to run Rhino and Grasshopper as Revit plugins. So McNeil have actually been refactoring it so that, well, just to explain a little bit about this then. So if you've used Grasshopper in the past, and there's obviously a very popular use case is how do I connect something like Grasshopper with Revit? Obviously Dynamo ties in with Revit very neatly because it sits inside it as a plugin. And then you'll find there's a few options with how you try and bridge these two applications when they have to run independently. So in particular, I've used IFC, which is part of the reason why I now have an intimate understanding about how to use IFC for design transfer view. And there are some other options which might include Speckle as a web server or Flux. Some of you might have used Flux. And often in that sort of use case, they create primitive data, reassemble it in Dynamo, and then use Dynamo as a Revit API to recreate models or concepts in the Revit environment. And then there's another whole suite of software that use Excel, or text files, or even pipes between the two applications to try and bridge those two things. But this is a recent, reasonably recent improvement where now we can actually trigger Rhino and Grasshopper as a Revit plugin. So now you can actually recognize or use the Revit API from directly within Grasshopper, which I think, I think one of the big benefits with going down this type of route is that Rhino has a very capable and comprehensive geometry library that isn't necessarily quite the case in Revit. And what I hope to do quickly is just demonstrate this a little bit about some tools that I'm doing around this. But also this, again, I can actually access the API directly in Revit, but I actually can use Ifc as a model store and use that then to hold these concepts without trying to pump the data into Revit. So Revit was never designed to create 1,000 elements 1 second and delete them the next. And that's also part of the reason why applications like Dynamo have this Solve Now button or a stage solve. Whereas, what I'm going to start demonstrating here perhaps is the ability to, in real time, explore your design and then update Revit on demand. So I'm just going to quickly check I'm in the right view for Revit. Maybe I'll just quickly change to level 1. But so my tools are still using Ifc in the background, like I said, and we'll look a little bit in the details about how it uses Ifc for this. But I have a pretty simple Grasshopper script here, which is literally making 4 grid lines. They have 2 in a sort of an X or in a Y direction and 2 in an X direction. And it's not really trying to do a live link with Revit. You can see I do get a preview in Grasshopper, in the Rhino viewport. But traditionally, you always had to click the bake to file, and my tools always then produced an Ifc file. And if we actually hover over the output of this, I know it's pretty small to see, but my plugins are basically a front end for the Ifc, so that I'm using Revit terms and Revit descriptions to create Revit concepts within the Grasshopper environment. But really, it's just a wrapper over the original version of this plugin, which was a whole bunch of hundreds of components, which actually each component, in effect, relates to each of the Ifc classes. And again, I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second, about what each class is. But so now, instead of having to write an Ifc file and then use I have developed over a number of years my own Ifc import plugin. So that I started that before Autodesk open sourced theirs. Otherwise, it may have become a different situation. But the emphasis on the Ifc import plugin that I've developed is it's there to update and revise a Revit model, not just open an Ifc file or link an Ifc file. So it has some fundamental differences in that sort of situation. So now I can actually click on this GG Revit Bake to Revit component, and then it should update and create these grid lines for me here in this model. Let's see. Okay, so here now you can see that it's created those 4 grid lines for me directly. It did use Ifc in the background, so the Grasshopper model passed the Ifc definition to my Revit plugin, which then converted these concepts into the Revit concepts on the fly within that Revit environment. Now, of course, if I'm a structural engineer and I want to start setting things off these grids, then maybe I want to start to place columns at grids. And of course, when I do that, if I actually go and manually move a grid line location, we get an automatic update of the position of the column because it's constrained to that intersection of those 2 curves. You can sort of see here that actually the Grasshopper preview is kicked in here, so I can actually see where it's out of sync with the Grasshopper. Of course, what I might like to do is have a bit more notification about when the Revit model gets out of sync with the Grasshopper definitions here. But again, I can actually replicate that grid moving process directly in Rhino. So if I want to change the grid location so it looks something maybe more like this, then you can see now the Revit update has changed and shown me the proposed grid locations. And if again I bake to Revit, we see that it actually moves and rotates the grids, the existing grids, into the positions. So those columns that I manually constrained are now still locked and hosted on those locations. I guess some of the benefit like this, if I'm the engineer in the Revit and I don't like that change, I can simply undo and go back to the previous version of this, etc. So, and I think one of the other benefits about this sort of approach where you use Ifc is I could actually make an archive copy of that model during that workflow. If I want to capture what was sent between Grasshopper and Revit over the duration of the program, I could just write a bunch of Ifc files each time I triggered that exchange. If I ever had to go back and revisit that for whatever reason there might be. Okay, So that's simple grid lines. I guess what I wanted to start to show then is Ifc. Now, if we want to get intelligent Revit models out of an Ifc diagram, then what we should actually achieve is instructions that would operate Revit the same way it would as if I was a manual user. So if I was going to create a beam or a framing element in Revit, then as a user, I would click on the framing button. I would then choose whatever family, and inherently with that family, it would know what material, whether it be concrete or steel, or what, at least what the default option should be for that material of that object. And then I'd nominate the location of the beam or the set out axes. So I'd pick 2 endpoints and I'd get an extrusion representation of that beam there directly in the Revit model. Now, if we're actually going to import Ifc into Revit and we want to get a native Revit beam that you can actually update and change and is a Revit beam, then what we'd have to say is that the Ifc would have to provide those same inputs that I gave it manually when I operated the Revit application. And I think that's part of the frustration when you go to import an Ifc file. If it's actually already meshed that shape, or if it doesn't actually give those inputs consistent with the way that I fed them in as a user, then it's hard to expect Revit to make a native Revit beam out of a dumb instruction. And that's, again, part of the reason. When you use Ifc for coordination, it doesn't necessarily have a lot of intelligence in the model. It might just literally say, this is how you can preview the geometry. And then that's why you get these direct shapes or objects in Revit when you import or open an Ifc that you actually can't change and edit. Okay, does that make sense? Or okay, so what is Ifc? Let's have a little bit more look at the nuts and bolts. Not that I think you guys should really ever have to do it, but you know, it might give some context about, and hopefully this demystifies Ifc a little bit for many of you if you haven't ever got into the nuts and bolts. So here's another Grasshopper script, and all this script really does is also make a framing object the same that I did when I manually made that. So you can see the inputs, and you should recognize that these inputs that I'm giving to the Grasshopper script are pretty much a replica of the steps that I did from the user interface to create that beam. So I have a catalog profile definition, which is telling me here it's a 360 UB 56.7. So it already then has a database which knows here's the depth of that eye shape, here's the width, here's the flange thickness, here's the web thickness, here's the root radius, etc. And Ifc is a technology that's about 20 years old, and the common way it's expressed is in this step file, which we'll look at in a second. But if you actually have studied Ifc, there's an order and a sequence to this that, having programmed Ifc for a while, I would recognize what each of these in order represented and mean in terms of defining that eye shape. I also have a definition of a Revit material. Some of the things I put on is enumeration, so you would recognize the class of the material, which you could select from a context menu on that. So I'm feeding in a memory and a material, and then I'm building a family or a framing type off that information. And again, here we could actually add parameters. We could add a type mark. You know, again, it's trying to provide the inputs to the Grasshopper programming environment the same as I would input them if I was actually editing the Revit model. And then finally here, I'm making an instance of that framing object. So again, there could be something like the usage, so whether it's a girder or a joist or a purlin, etc. The mark, the axis, the justification, so whether I want a top mid. So this is one of the big improvements in Ifc 4. In Ifc 2.3 or 2x3, it's actually pretty much everything is extruded around its middle axis. But in Ifc 4, they started to add some justification, so you can actually control the position of the profile relative to the axis curve. If I wanted to override the material, I could do it. And if I want to set parameters, I could also do that. Okay, so if that makes sense, then you can see here that effectively I'm making a beam through the Grasshopper instructions. And if I click on this GG RVT bake to file thing, great, I'm in debug mode, then what it will do is it will prompt me to actually write an Ifc file, and I'll overwrite this file that I created earlier. Okay, so if I go and find that file, so as I said, the way that Ifc is commonly expressed is it's written in this came from about 20 years ago when things were stored on floppy disks. And I guess the cutting edge technology or the obvious choice that they selected was using step, which is, again, you know, you can recognize these keywords. So each one of these is a class or concept in Ifc. And if we scroll down through this, we'd find some things we might recognize, like the units. This file's in millimeters. We'd find some properties. And if we look hard enough, we'd find a material definition, a member type or a family, the member definition, and then maybe some other properties like the property that I created manually. Now, again, that's all right for me as a computer scientist to sit and study that and read that, but the average person should never have to worry about that detail. One of the other superior options then for trying to recognize and capture that is actually writing it as an Ifc Xml file. So the Ifc Xml file is more modern, and it's actually a little bit more human readable in that every attribute gets tagged, so I don't have to know the order of the attributes. And then again, you can actually nest these things through relationships, although again, I'm not necessarily doing this strictly compliant with the Ifc XML schema. But we'd recognize here's a building, and then the building might have stories, and then the stories might contain elements or spaces, and you can actually view the Ifc Model Hierarchy. We can see here we've got a member, which is my framing object, and then it's got a related material or a profile. Here's the eye shape with its web thickness and flange thickness, etc. And it's got a placement and other attributes down the bottom, which would include the units, etc., like that. So again, I wouldn't actually recommend that the average Revit user or anyone interested in exchanging IFC should actually need to go into the nuts and bolts of this. But it is a superior way of starting to inspect the contents of the IFC file, because I think one of the biggest frustrating parts of using IFC as an end user at the moment is that when something doesn't work, how do you validate where the problem is? So you get one software vendor pointing the finger at the other, and you're caught in the middle about actually, is that IFC file correct, and is it a authoring problem or is it an importing problem when you're actually starting to try and troubleshoot these things? Okay. So just to show an even slightly more complex example then, I guess. So again, I think, as I mentioned before, I think Grasshopper and Rhino are actually industry agnostic. So you could very well find that your shoes have been designed in Rhino, your jewelry, marine. It actually came out of marine for ship hulls. So and it uses splines or NURBS, which is one of its biggest features. And so what I've started to set up here is a script here, which actually creates a spiral in Grasshopper, and then starts to set up a bunch of columns that actually get set up off this spiral. And of course, I'd like to orient each of them so that they basically face either perpendicular to the curve or into the origin of the model as part of this workflow. And because I'm not trying to do a live link with Revit, then I actually in real time can see a preview of these changes in Grasshopper as I do it. So if I want to reduce the number of columns being created, then I can move this slider, and basically in real time, you get this updated preview in Rhino. Rhino's not technically, I mean, I guess where you draw the lines on these things, I don't know, is Excel a BIM authoring software or not? But you know, Rhino isn't technically BIM, so all it's really concerned about is visualizing or representing that object, and then I'm storing all the other attributes and things like that in the background. So it's a little bit different to trying to, in real time, update Revit, which is also then trying to maintain a whole bunch of other relationships and associations as you try and push that data into it. So the idea then being, what we should see, if I zoom out, is we should see a preview of that spiral. And we probably should see, again, the column position line. So I can still see, at the moment, it will actually preview mesh, but it won't preview the extrusions that I'm drawing there. And these obviously aren't things I can select. They're basically just being displayed on the Revit viewport. I guess then, if I've settled on this design, and this is what I want to send to Revit, is that then I can click on the bake to Revit component, and what it's then going to do is add however 80 or 90 or however many I'd set that number slider to columns to the Revit database. Again, there should be it's sort of a 6 or 7 minute sync time for about 80 or 90 objects. And again, I'll talk in a second. You can do this in a live link, but you do start to get this lag where it's constantly trying to change the Revit model, which isn't necessarily so user-friendly with the work that they're doing. But now you can see it's actually added the column objects to Revit. These are native, wherever possible, I'd like to make a native object. At some point in time, a parametric model normally gets locked off, and all changes and revisions get done manually thereafter. So ideally, someone should open this model in 5 years' time or 10 years' time or next week and not tell if it was actually created by my plugin or by another user previously. So I can actually go in and start to edit, move these things around, change the family assignment, etc., etc. I should be able to start tagging them, adding extra properties that I wouldn't want to necessarily generate in Grasshopper, and do various other tasks and things like that that might like to be done downstream in the Revit environment. Now, this isn't just a one-way trip, this export as well. Well, one, we can actually round trip the data back. One, you can actually reference the Revit API in Grasshopper now. So, well, let's touch on that for a second. So McNeil themselves have now started to build their own Revit components, which load when you run Grasshopper within Revit. And some of these things then allow you to pull objects out of the Revit database, the same as you can reference them in Dynamo. So if you want to reference, here's a family picker, or here's a level picker, or here's find an element by name or by ID or something like that, is that then you can start to reference those things directly in the Grasshopper environment. My sort of approach, and I guess I'm Mr. IFC in many ways, is instead you can actually write an Ifc file and then import the Ifc file context back into the Grasshopper environment. So that's sort of one way of round tripping the data. I'm also really concerned or want to enable the ability to update and revise the model, not just generate it once. And the way that I've been doing that is, anyone again that's looked at Ifc might have noticed that every element has this funny looking string, which is a unique identifier. And that is basically one way of actually identifying an element from one version of a model to another, or what is represented as that object in a different context or a different model. And so what happens is then, if I go to actually revise the Grasshopper script, is that then if I now say maybe I reduce the number of columns being created on this, what I really want the plugin to do is, one, move every column that's already there into its new position, and two, delete any of the obsolete or redundant columns that still exist in that model that are no longer associated in this Grasshopper script. So if I actually hover over, or maybe have a quick look at the preview about the objects coming out of this Grasshopper script, and then what we'll see here is these list of funny looking strings being prefixed on each of the columns that are being generated. And each one of those now, when I go to update Revit, will search for that element with that unique identifier string, and then, as I said, move it or delete it if it's no longer live in this Grasshopper context. So if I click on the GG Revit Bake to Revit component again, so now what it's going to do is it basically has assembled a list of all the unique identifiers that are now no longer used. And we should see that it will actually, again, because the family and the profile is being dictated from Grasshopper, those couple of columns that I actually changed and moved location for reverted back to the Grasshopper nominated profile and were moved back into their original position. If I wanted to prevent that, I can actually do that. So let's say I want to copy this column, and let's make it obvious by changing its profile size. Again, in my Ifc importer, there's a bunch of tools for managing some of this stuff. So if I want to remove the Ifc unique identifier so my plugin would never recognize it, then I can click on Remove Ifc ID, and now you'll see that that parameter has been blanked out. And so if I actually come back to Grasshopper and update and revise this model, this column will no longer be recognized, and it will be retained through the update process. So if I click on the bake, then we'll see a new column. Well, that's interesting. Let's see, it should still work. And this is brand new, I've got to say, this is literally only a week old. So if I now let that error message through, then I do get my column, a new column in that position. But because I broke that association with the Grasshopper script, that column would never be touched again unless I reset that unique ID. Okay, there's a few other utilities and stuff in the Ifc plugin that I've got. Even, I think it's not very nice that you can't manage the unique identifiers for the project, the building, and the site in Revit. So one of these components here, if I can spot it, is to set global Ifc Ids. So if you've got a client, like Schiphol, let's say you've got to give this unique identifier to this building or this site, then you can now control that. That's most of my tools I charge for. That's how I can sustain the development of them. Some of these are free, so you can get my contact details off the slides or come and see me. And so some of these tools, very simple utilities, are available free. You just have to install the plugin to do it. You can select things by Ifc Ids. You can extract Ifc Ids. So if I want to know what the Ifc Ids are of these columns, I can click on here and say extract Ifc Ids. And then if I go back to Notepad and then paste, then we should see these unique identifier strings formatted into clipboard for that. The other thing actually I want to do is make this update based on mark. So if we controlled the mark in the Grasshopper script on each of these elements, rather than rely on that unique identifier, is that we could actually then update things recognized. One of the inputs here on the column is we could automate the generation of a mark on each of these columns, and maybe that should be the key in the master about how to identify an object from one version of a model to another, rather than managing these strange looking strings that are pretty difficult to recognize. Again, there's also a bunch of stuff that I've been doing, consulting to Transport for New South Wales, that we might talk about in the next session, breakout session. But even how a client, again, we can use shared parameters file definition to define what are the parameters that we should have loaded in our Revit project. IFC4 provided a new classes to manage property templates, which does have a global ID. It can tell you the units, it can tell you various characteristics, etc. And I've been developing some tools that allow you to load that in effectively as a shared parameter file, so that you can actually use those properties from a neutral open BIM format, rather than a client like Schiphol saying, well, here's a shared parameter definition file. They could publish an IFC template which has those definitions, which could then be used in or recognized in ArchiCAD and Vectorworks and EcoSim, etc., etc. Okay. Yeah, please. Great. Yep. Well, at the moment that would be lost, but again, if we'd actually set a mark on this, as long as we had some way of mapping and identifying an element, we could push the unique identifiers back into that model, absolutely. So mark would be the obvious way to do it for me, but it could be some other parameter, like a shared parameter or a project parameter or some. As long as we had a way of identifying and then creating a mapping table, we could easily push the unique identifiers back in onto the objects as part of that. I should say, again, okay, yeah, okay. Does that answer the question, or? Cool. Again, I think that's really great. I think there's some really interesting technologies like Speckle and Flux was quite popular. And I think one of the things that amazed me when I started so Speckle is basically you can set up a database online, a web server, whatever you want to call it, and you can push and pull data to it. And like this is basically how Flux worked. Instead of relying on files, you can basically publish to a data key on an online server. I think there's a couple of things I could endorse about Speckle, which is effectively an open source version of Flux, or at least the part of Flux that most people are using. One, it's open source, so there's no possibility of the pin being pulled out and all of your data that you've been relying on your provider to store being told to download it, and that's terminated. Two, you can run it on your own servers. So I think it's important. Cloud technology is great, but ideally you should be able to control your own cloud services that offer that. So Speckle offers you that opportunity. And three, I think the really amazing thing with Speckle was with just a few days' work, we were able to use IFC snippets to send and receive IFC or data models and representations of BIM objects throughout the IFC data schema. So it's something, again, I can point you to some presentations about demonstrating this. I'm not going to do it now, but it's also, particularly if you're collaborating outside of your company, if you want to establish grids, levels, other project inputs, etc., instead of relying on someone emailing a file, you can actually host that data and then get automatic updates or notifications when you're out of sync about how to update and respond to that type of change. This is showing an example of actually an Ifc alignment. So these are some of the concepts that have been published, and a lot more are coming with the road and rail and bridge enhancements to the Ifc schema that are coming. So even the ability to then take a civil 3D alignment and then reference that in Grasshopper and parametrically set out a bridge or something through an extent of it can be quite a powerful workflow. So I guess the emphasis on my work for the last 10 years has really been about interoperability. So I guess with a structural engineering background, particularly the early emphasis on the tools was all about building structural analysis models primarily from Rhino, and then quickly turning attention to BIM and sort of how do we bridge Grasshopper and Revit, which is something that I've sort of been providing for 6 or 7 years. I think this is sort of a really interesting case study about, how do we use technology and modern processes to, I guess the thing no one really enjoys doing is tracing. So if we can avoid making multiple models of the same thing, there's major efficiency gains. No one likes checking for coordination between models, and I suspect no one loves checking shop drawings. And again, if you can actually, this workflow with Arup basically went through to the documentation model with Revit. We actually also did get the workflow going all the way through to Tekla so that the fabrication model was directly sourced from the master model. But for various reasons, that option wasn't actually nominated from the contractor. And I think and again, obviously there are other benefits with individually or independently creating a fabrication model. But I guess there's a lot less shop drawing checking to do if you know that the model was sourced from an original set out rather than an independently created model. So it's quite an interesting, this is a bridge in Sydney, which should be under construction at the moment. Also help, again, as I said, tracing models is not a particularly good use of anyone's time. So I'm not showing a lot about this model really. It's a stadium which is just about to be open, and then hopefully I can talk a lot more about it. But this was a really interesting one because from the start of detailed design, there was no structure modeling done in Revit. So I guess there was a tight budget and a tight construction program. So the fabricator wanted to do all the structural modeling, so he knew that what he was modeling or she was modeling was actually what was going to get built. Now, of course, the architects don't use Tekla, so they're at a bit of a loose end, and the engineers have a Tekla license, but would prefer to do all their documentation and other sort of processes in Revit as they typically do. So Tekla provide their own live link, Tekla provide their own link with Revit, but for various reasons that worked again for a sort of a once-up import, but not necessarily for a revise and update. So you'd lose all your tags, you'd lose any custom parameters, you'd have to basically do a bunch of work to recreate that model downstream. So they started discussing it with me, and because I had this Ifc importer with a little bit more work, it worked really quite neatly at updating and revising this model. Again, not really totally dependent on those global unique identifiers. In Tekla, they're actually modeling a master bay and copying arraying around again. And of course, all the unique identifiers got revised every time they did that. So again, there were some smarts built in to try and detect one version of a model or an object to the previous, so that we did try and preserve tags and parameters and things like that as much as possible. I guess IFC is always going to be an exchange, and unless applications are actually saving and opening IFC natively, there's always some sort of approximation or simplification which is required. And I guess some of the difficulties with this one, you'll actually see these plats, the seating precast concrete members. That actually is a native framing object, and we did actually automate the generation of the voiding features to shape the webs, etc. We did have a bit of trouble with the vometry walls with the precast shaping of them. So in this particular case, we did have to run the IFC through a small modification processing Rhino just to give us the faceted resultant geometry, because some of the Boolean operations that Tekla was doing, Revit just wasn't able to handle. So Revit has a whole bunch of limitations and constraints, which are often the reason why it's not necessarily selected to create fabrication models like this. There also is a bunch of work about extracting structural analysis, BIM to structural analysis. I have a few plugins. Again, I guess I've been able to create a core part of code and then reuse it with various interfaces for multiple purposes. So I do have some Revit plugins that actually exchange with SAP 2000 and ETABS and Strauss 7 and a few other different structural analysis applications without requiring you to try and weld all the nodes and do a lot of manipulations of the structural analysis model directly in Revit. There's some also real, IFC, if IFC is capable of this, then coordination model view is basically this small subset of it. And I think there's some really interesting enhancements with Synchro and various other things about how do we actually better use 4D and 5D and beyond information in Revit. Here you can sort of see what I call a Grasshopper Gantt chart, where you can actually start to set up tasks and schedule them or sequence them, etc., through the IFC concepts, and then use something like Synchro to produce an optimized schedule of those tasks, etc. Again, I do sort of have a Navisworks plugin which does basic enhancements. So Navisworks doesn't recognize colors. It also doesn't recognize the 4D planning information, etc. So you can effectively run a second loop of the IFC file with my plugin and get some of that information enhanced into the Navisworks model as part of that. So I guess a few points. So I mean, again, I think, as I said, it's really great to come to Holland because I definitely have noticed and seen and observed a really good demand for improving OpenBIM. So congratulations to you guys. I can only encourage and support you to do more of it. So the thing is, all the software vendors are businesses, so they're going to try and do, hopefully, or they're going to try and recognize what they think is going to keep their business growing and increasing and retain their cluster compliance and get new ones. And so the more that you can put pressure on them to provide better implementations, etc., the better their software support's going to be of IFC and OpenBIM. So if you can demand better from your software vendors, I think demand for better validation tools. So if you're frustrated, you shouldn't have to understand IFC to the level I have, but you need some better reporting and validation tools to try and do this. Demand IFC 4 certification. These are some conversations that I've had there. It's not just all on the vendors about this. Certainly Building Smart are trying to quickly learn some lessons about how we do this better for IFC 5. And support Building Smart. I can only ask for that more. I know John Burke, the guy, James Burke, I think is the guy that did that video that I showed, said IFC is free. Well, it would be lovely if that was the case, but Building Smart certainly also needs support. So if you can do that, I'd certainly encourage and appreciate that as part of that. So I don't know, I guess that's basically what I had planned to say or demonstrate. I don't know if that hopefully gives you maybe a view of IFC in maybe a way you haven't seen it before. Certainly there's my contact details. I'm going to be around for the rest of the day, so if you have any questions, you can, I guess there's time for questions now, Mark, but otherwise get in touch with these details, and I look forward to those conversations.
Yeah, I would say, are there any questions? Or are we all our minds blown? I'm thinking, I don't know shit.
Got a few cells left.
Huh?
Got a few cells left. Is there an open mic? Is it on?
No. Ja, volgens mij wel.
It's on now?
Geen idee.
It's on now.
Yeah, it's on. Okay. John, you were showing us about moving data from Grasshopper, Rhino plugin, which is awesome in some right, to Revit, and giving it to undo change. When my architect makes a change in the model and processes it to the engineer downstream, the engineer might want to accept some changes, others push back on or comment. So those are two questions basically. How do you push back on some of it and not all of it? And how do you comment on some of it?
Okay, that's some really good questions. One, I've done a little bit of work. Even it's how do I know what I can rely on? If I'm the engineer and you're the architect, I can rely on your honesty to tell me what's changed since you last gave me a model. Or we can have different validation tools which can actually tell me what's changed. So I know, I sort of describe myself as a trailblazer or a prototyper, and hopefully showing some of these concepts and workflows, and then hoping that helps you guys know what to ask your big software vendors to actually implement and provide us better, more robust tooling that comes out of the box with the applications you use. So I certainly have done some work on how do I detect changes between two IFC files. That was actually used a lot on this Stadium project. So instead of updating the whole model, we could say, here's your last IFC model, here's the one you've given me today, and then write out a third file with just the changes, and then just push the changes into Revit. So we're absolutely certain that anything that hadn't changed would remain unchanged in the Revit model. Now, I can't really say I've got tooling yet or user interface that allows you to cherry pick which changes you accept and which changes you reject, but absolutely that's a great idea, and that would be a useful enhancement and improvement to add to that process. Now, in terms of how you actually communicate that, and again, I'm not an expert in BCF, and I know, I can't see where, but, oh yeah, so right next to you, you know who to talk to about BCF. So obviously BCF is a good way of communicating issues and getting coordination and things like that. So that would be one mechanism about creating a log about these are the changes I reject, giving them back to the designer or the other project participant, and allowing them to come back to you about whether they have whether you can come to a consensus about how to handle those things or not. Does that answer the question, or not quite? Okay, good.
Must be more. Come on. No?
The level of BIM. Sorry. You talk about Dutch, which are preset on Open BIM. Yeah. How does it compare to Australia? Thanks. It's a really good question. I don't know how many of you guys have been involved with Building Smart International, but anyone that has over the last 2 decades would probably know John Mitchell. And he's sown a lot of seeds in Australia. He's been trying to convince and arm wrestle governments for years to not necessarily mandate BIM, but demand open BIM basically on their projects, etc. So, I mean, again, I guess I get an interest. I mean, again, I still get a biased view, and I have my own biased opinions about what I'll respond to with these things. But I guess having clients around the world, I do get some insights into what is happening, and I think there's pockets of excellence everywhere. And there's obviously, you could still go to Australia and find AutoCAD being used to draft plenty of projects still at this point in time that I don't necessarily see, say, here in Holland or in Scandinavia or some of these other countries here. But it's really encouraging that the governments are actually really getting behind Open BIM now. This is why the infrastructure work is so important. And that's really going to snowball. Again, Building Smart Australasia made a concerted effort to run more events and build more of a community last year, and now the fact the governments are getting behind Open BIM is only going to place more importance on that work and enhancing and building that community. So it's certainly emerging. I wouldn't, again, as I said, there's pockets of excellence in different areas in different countries. But yeah, it's certainly, Australia's sort of, I'd say it's sort of in the ballpark of where other countries are. Maybe not so much in the end use case of some of the designers there.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. There's a lot of people working with project libraries. Actually, manufacturers are making new objects, which are then also going to the tool and other properties. Do you have a certain ID or a PIN or in general how they should go? I know this is a very broad question.
Well, and again, I mean, I deliberately didn't touch too much on this just because the work that I've done has primarily been with Mark and Martijn. So I'm pretty sure they can talk about it a lot here and don't necessarily need me to do. But I certainly have given some technical support to BIMforce with the work on the Uniform Object Library. And I'm a strong advocate about a common, if a government wants to produce an object library, there's no way they should have to give a Revit RFA file. They should have the definition of their objects and their properties and the templates of the properties. And then that should be able to be basically input into the different authoring software that the consultants, etc., would want to use. And I think, again, the big benefit that you get from this, I mean, again, this is like a whole different presentation again, but if the end user can actually configure various inputs on that object library, the better, because that's part of the reason why people produce object libraries and then they aren't used anywhere to their near full potential. So, the end user wants to configure whether it's hosted or non-hosted, or the language, whether it's French or Italian or Dutch or whatever else it might be, whether it's materials or the styling or their own templates or whatever else it might be. If you just download an RFA file, all those decisions have already been made for you. And again, I'm sure, as I said, Mark and Martijn, and maybe we'll touch on this a little bit more in our second session now as well. But yeah, I'm a big advocate that, we did this proof of concept work for the Uniform Object Library. You can have connectors and ports. You can have constraints. You can even define constraints in IFC4. They still need improvement, but you can actually have constraints and flex the objects and content you create out of an IFC definition.
We even did the annotation.
Yeah, exactly. So IFC is capable of a lot, but again, we need industry to push the software vendors. I know we're speaking with DDS. Hopefully, I think they've been better at very interested in further improving. They've been involved in this project as well. So again, hopefully we can build some momentum behind it.
Yeah, if you want to know more, I think that Martijn, John has a next session together with Martijn, and you will definitely touch on this and what it requires and how it actually works and how it will liberate basically the industry. Other questions? Still? No? He's here now.
When is he leaving?
Sorry, he's booked until he leaves. So you've got today until this is finished.
I am coming back up for Built in Edinburgh as well, and whether we get back to Holland or not later in the year, we'll see. But maybe it'll give you a chance to digest some of the stuff I've spoken about, and we can follow up. Obviously, we can do stuff online as well. And, you know, again, Mark and Martijn, particularly in the object library, across this. And, you know, again, you've got a lot of IFC experts, Peter and various others around here. So you can be just strategic and technical backup to some of those guys if it's the area that they're not necessarily so familiar with. So. Yeah.
I've got another question about the Rhino plugin.
Yeah.
Very promising. I know it's not the core of the presentation, but if nobody else has questions, I'd like to know a little more about that. How does that work?
Well, you've got like 50 minutes coming up.
15 or
50. 40, 40 in the next session.
No. But, I mean, again, it's interesting. Do you mean Bim in Rhino itself or Grasshopper?
I'm talking about the Rhino plugin and then using Grasshopper on top of that.
Yeah. And so, what would you like me to explain further? Can you give?
Basically, is it a software that I buy somewhere?
Okay, yeah. That's a good question. So it's interesting. Neil actually are doing their development open source. So this version of it over here that does a live link is open source. So you can download that off GitHub. Mine, I'm a third-party independent, so I rely on the revenue streams to support these developments. So with my development, you can actually run it inside of Revit or outside of Revit, which I think is one of the other benefits. So you can assemble that IFC data model, whether it's running in Revit or out. And what it really meant was that within a day's work, all these components ran just writing an IFC file as that bridge between Grasshopper and Revit previously. And all it meant was I basically had to merge my code base with my Revit plugin and my Grasshopper plugin into one, and then just send the IFC in memory between the two. So this is about 3 or 4 years worth of work, the components that I've done here. Sorry, I'm showing the IFC ones rather than the Revit ones. But, you know, it's again, all this work's done on demand. So users come to me with suggestions and requests and ideas, and I've been able to quickly support many of them about what they'd actually like to generate in Grasshopper and get resulting in Revit. So again, you can download and try this for at least a month for free. And then if you find it useful and helpful, then yeah, you can take up a floating license to continue its use. So.
Okay. I want to thank John